I'm here today with Sandhya Rani Jha. Sandhya serves as founder and director of the Oakland Peace Center, a collective of 40 organizations working to create equity, access, and dignity as the means of creating peace in Oakland, California, and the Bay Area. A multiply published author and widely requested public speaker and anti-oppression trainer, Sandhya's over 20 years of community organizing experience position her to help cultivate sustainable social movement work at the local and regional level. An ordained pastor with a master's in public policy, Sandhya is comfortable in the pulpit, on the picket line, or hanging out with friends and friends-to-be over a good cup of tea and a good story. She's the author of a new book entitled Liberating Love Daily Devotional, 365 Love Notes from God, from Chalice Press. So Sandhya, it's a real pleasure to meet you and to have you on our interview series today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Brian.
Well, it's my pleasure. You know, as I said, I love getting to meet new authors, and, you know, you've published several different books. So I want to talk about that, but maybe before we even get to that point, if you could just please tell us more about the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I was telling some folks recently that I have what some people refer to career devolution. I started out working in Congress, and then I worked for a national religious liberties organization, and then I worked for the regional staff of the Disciples of Christ in Northern California, and then I took a tiny little scrappy church in Oakland that I have since turned into the Oakland Peace Center, which is a collective of nonprofits working to address the root causes of violence, things like economic violence and inequity and lack of access to housing. So I do a lot of front lines work with low-wage workers. I do a lot of work with housing justice, and in Oakland, there's been a lot of displacement of multi-generational Black families from our community. We do a lot of organizing work around that. And we also do a lot of cultural preservation work, trying to maintain the culture of this community in the midst of that displacement crisis. So all of that is part of my work.
So, I mean, in some sense, it sounds like a new definition of a church.
I love that idea. In fact, I was saying recently, the Oakland Peace Center is technically a secular organization, but since part of our purpose is to invite people to bring their whole selves, for folks who are radical activists, this is one of the few places they can bring their spiritual selves. And ritual matters a lot to us, and things that honor our ancestors matter a lot to us. And so I will occasionally have, you know, a young aspiring rapper that I've known for a while introduce me to his friends as the pastor of the Oakland Peace Center. And it feels kind of appropriate, even though, like I said, technically a secular 501c3 nonprofit organization.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, I mentioned you've published a lot of books before this one. So before we dive into the new book, I'd love to hear, you know, kind of your publishing background. What all different things have you written?
Yeah, so it's funny because I kind of stumbled into writing. I'm not necessarily I've always wanted to be the next Tom Clancy kind of story. My very first book was the history of people of color in my denomination, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. And the reason I wrote it is I was sitting in my seminary classes and I kept thinking over and over, all of these books make it sound like there were only white disciples, and I don't think that's true. And the dean of Disciples Divinity House said, Sandhya, you can keep complaining about it or you can do something about it. So I wrote that book kind of out of desperation because there was nothing out there that told the story of people of color in our denomination. And then it was a number of years before the publisher at Chalice Press said, I believe our press needs to get a lot more serious about racial justice, and you blog about that a lot. I think you're the voice that we need to hear right now. And that's what led to the book Pre-Post-Racial America, Spiritual Stories from the Front Lines, which came out just after Michael Brown's murder. And it was a collection of stories of my friends from different racial ethnic backgrounds. I used to joke that it was my way of lending my friends of color to white people. And also, I think that one of the challenges we face in racial justice work is my community, the South Asian community, knows what our challenges are, and we don't know much about East Asians. We don't know much about Latinos. We don't know much about Black people. And that's true for all communities of color. I think that if we got to know each other's struggles, we could find more common cause. So that was also why I wrote that one, so that we could show up for each other better. My last book, I do have that one in front of me, is Transforming Communities, how people like you are, I can't read that backwards, are healing their neighborhoods. And Transforming Communities was really my chance to respond to my calling in a very particular way. I think that my purpose is not to convince people that social justice matters, and not to bolster the folks who are already doing the work, although I try to do that. My real calling is to the folks who are looking around and saying, this is not how the world should be, and I don't know what to do first to make it different. And so Transforming Communities really kind of captured the best of my organizing work. I do a lot of work with the radical front lines here in Oakland, but my nationwide work is really helping regular church folks realize what power they have, what tools they have, and that they don't need to create anything from scratch. That's really my kind of national mission.
Wow.
And that's what Transforming Communities was about, was saying there are 10 stories of regular folks transforming their communities. You can do the same thing.
Interesting.
And now here we are with the new one.
So, before we get to the new one, we've got an election coming up, right? And our country is just about as polarized as I've ever seen it.
Yeah.
And in the Faith, Hope, and Love During Elections series of interviews I've been doing, one of the things that keeps coming out as a theme of how do we address this issue is really at what I'll call the grassroots local level. Of the kind of, I'll call peace collaboration, to hijack one of your words, that you're doing.
Yeah.
And so maybe we could talk just for a moment about that. I mean, what's your feeling about how we heal after this election?
I think it's a good question. And I think it assumes that there's a before that we want to get back to. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to reject that premise, because I think there were a lot of jokes in communities of color after the 2016 election, because communities of color were like, how are white people surprised? This is just America showing itself to be what we've always known it to be. And I don't want to say that people of color think there's no difference between the current administration and previous ones. I'm not trying to say that. But to a lot of us, this moment feels like an illuminating moment rather than a shift. So much that was hidden but going on is now visible and going on. And so for me, I do a lot of anti-racism work. I do anti-racism trainings. I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work for people who are scared of saying that they want to do anti-racism work. I do a lot of work in that arena, and I increasingly make kind of the tent pole of my work accountability to communities of color, because I think for real healing in this country to happen, we're going to have to be really honest about the fact that there's never been a point in our history where we have actually been accountable to communities of color.
Oh, yeah. There's no question about that.
And so we're going to have to make a shift into a new thing rather than think of ourselves healing something so we can go back. And I know that that's not what you were saying, certainly. But I think sometimes unconsciously that's what we're thinking. How can we get back to what it was like during the Obama administration, for example?
This is a hundreds of year old problem that our country's never dealt with.
Yeah, that's right.
And maybe we're getting closer to dealing with it, but
yeah, I do think that's
quite frankly skeptical about how far or how quickly we're able to go, because quite frankly we have so frickin' far to go.
We have a lot of work still to do. I think Colson Whitehead is one of my favorite writers, and in his book The Underground Railroad, he talks about the foundation of this country being stolen labor on stolen land.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Plain and
those are the
simple.
original sins of this country that
Mhm.
we have yet to fully heal. So
Mhm.
when I think about
Yeah.
healing after the election, I think that's a big part of it. And then the story of immigration is the story of exploitation of labor. So we've got a lot of work to do on all of those fronts.
Mm, mm.
I know that's not cheerful because it's not a quick fix. That's
No,
decades
no.
long work.
It's not a quick fix at all. That's, one of the real challenges. I mean, particularly when, if if we come to this conclusion that a lot of this local collaboration work,
Yeah.
to bridge divides is the way to go.
Yeah.
That is not a quick
No.
fix. You know what I mean? That's just going to take a lot of effort, a lot of time, and, kind of a mass realization. And I'm not
Yeah.
sure we have yet. Maybe we're getting closer, but I don't think we're.
I do think we're getting closer, and I do think there are moments, right? This is something that my political science and politics training teaches me, is there's a window that opens every 20 years or so. And I do think that this is one of those window moments. The one thing I want to offer as I think it's a note of encouragement. I used to work, I hope it's okay for me to say this, my primary organizing work in my early mid-20s was against the religious right. And when I was at the Interfaith Alliance, we were working really hard in response. We really were formed in response to the Christian Coalition. And so I know enough from my organizing work to know that the moment we're in right now is the result of 50 years of very intentional strategic work going back to when Nixon and Haldeman were saying, oh, if we can figure out how to manipulate the conservative religious folks, we can hold on to power in a whole different way. Going all the way back to the Nixon tapes, right, the Haldeman tapes. And I think what's really important about that is they started local. By the 90s, they were taking over school board by school board, and then city council, town council by town council. And that was the precursor to the horrific, I would say, fascist moment that we're in. By the definition of historians of fascism, not by the, we throw around the term really cavalierly, but by the historic definition. That's the moment we're in, when the president is calling for people to vote twice and see if they can get away from it. That's a demonstration of fascism. So in this moment, it took 50 solid years of neighborhood by neighborhood strategizing to get to this moment. And I think the good news is, and this is what I talk about in Transforming Communities, we're at the beginning of the next 50 years. These are our 50 years. And the thing is, the vision that we are casting is a life-giving vision. It's an affirming vision. It's a hope-filled vision. It's a much more joyful vision. I would rather live in a vision of joy than in a vision of terror and fear. And that's all they have to offer. Terror and fear.
Yeah.
And so I think if we can be as disciplined, as strategic, as neighborhood by neighborhood, as long as we make it through the environmental crisis, and that's a maybe, the next 50 years are going to be glorious. We just have to step up.
So let's get to the new book. Since originally a premise of our...
That's true. We were supposed to talk about that.
Here's the book, Liberating Love, a daily devotional, 365 love notes from God. So this obviously is a significant departure, from the type of book that you've written before. So how did that happen?
Yep. I think that's a good question. And before I get to that, I just want to say you had John Pavlovitz on your Compassionate Christianity series just recently. His wife designed the cover.
No. Well,
yes,
that's great.
Isn't that so cool?
I didn't even know that she did that kind of work.
I know. Chalice Press bragged to me about who they had gotten to design my cover. That's how I know.
That's great.
So it is a departure for me in that it's a much more kind of, I don't want to say purely spiritual, but it's a much more traditional spiritual resource. I think I tend to be known as the person that spiritual people can go to talk about politics. And this is an interesting moment because I find that the people I'm hearing from about this book are sometimes activists who are saying, I didn't know I needed this spiritual care until I got this book. So in some ways, it's my political people who are finding spiritual nurture from me, which is a very confusing experience. It's very much a role reversal for me. I will say, this is going to sound kind of cheesy as far as the origin story goes. I was picking up a copy of probably the most popular devotional in this country, maybe around the world, that a friend had given me, and I was about to give it away to, the book collection that we have sitting outside the Oakland Peace Center. And as I was holding it, I found myself thinking, I wish there were a version of this devotional that did the same thing, that helped people feel connected to their Creator, but also helped them feel connected to each other and helped them feel connected to their ancestors, so that it was about community and not just about me and Jesus. And as I was holding the book, I heard a voice say, yeah, you're supposed to do that. And I was alone in my apartment, and I'm sure there are many people who assume that I hear voices. To me, I thought it was the voice of God. And that meant that I felt an obligation to follow through on it. So that was how it started. I am really fortunate that I've had great teachers of the Bible who have helped me notice that the Bible was not written about me and Jesus, singular. The Bible is a collection of books written for communities. It's an instruction manual on how to be community. And I think so often the American version of Christianity has been co-opted by the dangerous mythology of individualism, which I do think it's a borderline heretical belief. But it has become so normative that even when we're reading something like the Lord's Prayer, we think it's about me and God, even when it says us and our the whole way through the prayer. So to me, this was an opportunity to reintroduce us to what I think is a foundational biblical principle of being community. So even though each devotion is written to you as the individual, it's almost always bringing you back to your understanding of your place in God's community.
Very cool. Very cool. So, we have a lot of writers in our audience, and so it'd be interesting for you to speak a little bit about just the writing process associated with doing a devotional as opposed to, the writing process that you use for your other books.
Yeah. So I had to create a whole bunch of tricks to get myself through this process. I did a lot of playing games with myself. Some of my friends were trying to figure out the rhyme or reason behind the scriptures, because January 1 is from Genesis, and January 2 is from Matthew, and January 3 is from Exodus, and January 4 is from Mark. And they're like, there's no coherent structure to this. And I was like, aha, to keep myself engaged, to keep myself from slipping into just doing the default scriptures that everyone does, I set it up so that the odd numbered days every other day is from the Hebrew Bible in order. And then the other days are through the New Testament in order. Which means I had to write on Jude multiple times. That sucked. But it forced me to engage the whole Bible. So in some ways, I kind of set up a game for myself where I was being forced to engage texts that got me curious, that got me angry, that got me puzzled. The reason it worked for me as a writer is I had made it curiosity invoking enough. I think some of my favorite writers, the guy who wrote Moneyball, talks about how he never starts writing with an agenda. He hears a story that intrigues him and he sees where it takes him. And as a result, he's written about the housing crisis. He's written about policy wonks on Capitol Hill. He's written about baseball. and he's always writing about how we solve the world's problems, but his starting place is story. What's a curious story? And I think in some ways I use that same technique. I also write against deadlines. I wanted to be a journalist for my first, I think from the age of 14 to the age of 20, I was single-minded about being a journalist. The downside of that is I've been trained to write to deadlines. So it was when I had promised someone I would get them the first month to look over, when I had promised someone I had the second month. So really, external accountability was what got me through this, which was a very different process than previous books.
No, I can imagine totally how that would be. And that's why I wanted to hear what your story was behind that, because
what kind of idiot sits down and writes 365 devotions? Good grief, what was I thinking?
It's a huge task.
It is.
Huge
yeah.
task. So what were you like basically trying to achieve? What was the outcome that you hoped for this book?
So I think it's Guy Kawasaki who kind of talks about you should always, and I will say for any authors out there, the best writing advice I ever got was from my friend Bruce Reyes-Chow. When I was starting out with Pre-Post-Racial America, he said, have you read Author, Publisher, Entrepreneur by Guy Kawasaki?
Yeah, I've read that book.
Yeah, it's the best thing. I mean, there's a lot of good things out there, but it is a nice, concise tool. And he talks about being really clear on your audience.
Yeah.
So I think I was very aware that there were a lot of my friends who were relying on a devotional that had kind of not great theology because they needed a devotional. And there were three groups of people I was thinking of. The first was my ex-evangelical friends. Once their theology shifted to a more compassionate Christianity, a more inclusive spirituality, they no longer had those resources, but they did have trained into them, I think, the really beautiful discipline of being grounded in the scripture every day. So I thought a lot about my ex-evangelical friends. I thought a lot about my friends of color who likewise will tolerate mediocre theology in order to have that daily practice, but wish there was something else out there. And I did think about my mainline church friends who maybe never developed a daily devotional practice because there wasn't anything out there that provided that kind of daily resource. Don't get me wrong. There are some amazing things out there. The UCC has a beautiful God is Still Speaking email. But wow, I have to carve out about 30 to 40 minutes for some of those devotions. And I need something that is digestible at the beginning of the day.
Yeah, that's what people want for that purpose, it seems like, something
exactly
that's more concise and brief.
And I think the assumption is either you can have rigorous theology that takes an hour to explain, or you can have vapid, hope-filled theology that you can do concisely. I think the message of God's radically inclusive love doesn't have to be expansive in order to be meaningful. So that's what I think I was playing with a little bit.
Cool. So in today's world, the importance of a platform, a following, is so important for authors. And so almost every conversation I have with an author, has to touch on that topic. Now you're more established. You've already, I think, built your platform, based on, previous books, previous years. But I'm curious as to your thoughts on that for you today. What does your platform mean to you, so to speak, and what do you do to invest in it?
Yeah, and so I think this was also Guy Kawasaki, although it might have been the book, Publish Your Book Like Wildfire, is that what it's called?
Oh, yeah. Was it Ryan Holiday? No.
It could be.
I'm not sure.
I remember the title, I don't remember.
Yeah. I read that one too, but it's been a couple of years.
So that one's, by the way, insider tip, I hope I don't get in trouble for sharing this. Chalice Press sends a copy of that book to every single one of their authors to help us build our platform, because it's got a formula that if the system works if you work it, right?
That's funny.
So it's a great resource. And it's funny because several of my fellow Chalice Press authors, I'll get their emails and I'll be like, oh, they're working the wildfire book. I see what they're doing. Good for them. They're building their platform. I'll be honest and say I didn't get very serious about that. And I'm only beginning to get really serious about it now. I have the maybe good fortune of the fact that I was already established as an anti-racism trainer when my book on race came out. Because I was already well known within my denomination around that work and around my work with the Oakland Peace Center, because it's kind of innovative work denominationally. When Transforming Communities came out, churches invited me to speak to them if they were thinking about alternative methods. And I had done a lot of coaching of churches that were trying to go through the transformation process. So Transforming Communities really fit my already established brand.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense.
So honestly, it's now that I'm beginning to get serious about that because my agenda with writing books, and I think most of us these days, not very many of us are writing books to get rich, but the books serve to open up opportunities for us to speak about the things we really care about with new audiences. So I really approach it much more from an organizing standpoint. How can I leverage this book to help me bring new people into this movement for justice?
Excellent.
So
it's a means to an end. It's a tool.
It is. And the platform building, so I don't think it's wrong to just build a platform to get your word out there, because no one would write a book if they didn't think they had something the world needed to hear. But I do think at the same time, some of those tools are valuable, the platform building tools are valuable if you're engaged in movement building work, if you're engaged in community organizing. I'm just now getting to a point where I'm saying, oh, I need to do a monthly newsletter about racial justice to broaden my audience who can then be partners in the work of racial justice with me.
Absolutely.
That's a standard 101 platform building strategy. Put out some free content every month, build up your audience, and then you can sell them the book. Except for me, and then I can sell them the movement.
Well, I mean, Ryan Holiday's got another good quote that basically says, a platform is not a means to an end. That's an end in itself, right? Because once you have a platform, then you can do whatever you want, whether it's write a book or speak or build a movement or what have you, right? So, I mean, it is such an incredible element to, all kinds of different initiatives and different directions.
Yeah, that's
and
absolutely.
You're proving that.
And I definitely have moments where I'm like, oh, I should have been doing this a long time ago.
Well, that's true for everyone, I think, too. I mean, no question about that. So a lot of our audience are new writers. What advice do you have for someone who's much more earlier stage right now getting started?
So, I think everybody's got a different structure. I will say that some of the best habits and practices I built were 1 year for Lent, I committed to the spiritual practice of, and remember, and forgive me for this, 10 years ago, blogging was actually a thing. So 10 years ago for Lent, I committed to a daily practice of writing and reflecting, particularly on justice issues through a spiritual lens. And honestly, that daily practice helped build an audience, helped build a following, and it also led to my publisher coming to me and saying, I know you write about this, I know you write about it well, we need your voice. So it was a good spiritual practice for me because it helped me work out some kinks, because I got feedback. People told me what they disagreed with and what they agreed with, and I learned where I wanted to make a stand and where I needed to listen to outside voices. So the daily practice is really valuable, and the rest of the world creeps in really, really easily. And that's why for most of my books, I have reached out to friends and said, would you be willing to look over this chapter for me? And that's helpful because it means I've set a deadline by which I need to get something written. So I really do believe it. For lazy writers like me, external accountability really helps. And not just, I've got to get it to the publisher, but long before you're even thinking about a publisher, getting friends to look stuff over and give you feedback can be a really helpful motivator if you know you've got an idea and you're struggling to find the time to make it happen.
I know some of the authors that I speak with, say similar things.
Really?
Having like a writing partner or a writing team, group or what have you.
Co-writing is a big thing right now. I have friends who will get on a Zoom call every day, every Monday at 2 to 4. And they literally just have their cameras on so that they're accountable to someone, and both of them write.
Same thing. I can name specific people who told me the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, how some of these different tools, that you might not necessarily expect to be effective, for some folks really are.
They joke about how it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I think there's so much discipline involved in it, and so much grind. And I don't think the grind's bad, because once I fall into the writing, it can get really exciting for me. The research, the stories that I'm uncovering, that really brings me alive. It's just sitting down and convincing myself I have something to say that's the hard part. That's the barrier I have to overcome.
Interesting. Well, before we wrap up, I'd really love if you don't mind reading one of today's daily devotionals. We're recording this on September 3rd, 2020. Could you share your day's devotional?
I'd love to. And in our rotation, I had mentioned going back and forth. Yesterday was from Colossians. Today is from 2 Samuel, as you would expect in a devotional. So today's devotional from September 3rd comes from 2 Samuel, chapter 7, verses 18 and 19. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord and said, "Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house, that you have brought me thus far? And yet this was a small thing in your eyes, O Lord God. You have spoken also of your servant's house for a great while to come. May this be instruction for the people, O Lord God." And the love note from God on this scripture. I remember so fondly my son David in the days when he was a humble and faithful servant, who as a result was brought to lofty positions. How I wish he could have remained so, and thus been the model of leadership I want for my beloved children. Today, I invite you to reflect on your own journey and where you have felt my presence. Your practice of gratitude not only honors me, it heals you.
Very cool. Very cool. Love it. I love it. Well, Shonda, it's been really a pleasure to get to know you, do this interview. Thank you so much for all the work that you've done, both on the ground there in California, as well as in your books and in your speaking.
Brian, likewise, thank you. I'm really grateful for what you're creating.
Well, it's been my pleasure, my gift, to be able to do this, gift to me to be able to do this. So it's nothing but a wonderful experience to meet people like you and be able to talk with folks like you and amplify your voices.
Thanks so much.